So, I'll shout out Cleve TA, who is one of the best CLEV TA, one of the great Twitter football follows there is. Does everything so objectively and so logically. But he was on the Megapod. We have all of our finest regular season Beating the Book Megapod guests on, as many as we can during the postseason. And he was kind enough to come on this last week with Will Hill, Todd Wishnev, and I. And he also does not have a play on the side of the Ravens-Chiefs game for reasons we got into earlier. He is all about the Niners, which was my instinct on Monday as well. He has them -6.5. He got them earlier in the week. I have them -7. I also took an alt line. I know, I did, on the Niners. Lions fans are probably not surprised. I'm big friends with the Lions fans this year. But I have the Niners -16.5 at +227 as well. Because I do feel like this is going to harken back to our childhood days where in championship games, blowouts are a possibility. And I think we're staring at one here. And listen, I think the Niners escaped their scare last week, and boy, did they escape. That was an absolute escape job against the Green Bay Packers. He points out, Cleve does a couple things about this matchup. One, the Detroit Lions offensively, no quarterback exploits the middle of the field quite as well as Jared Goff, and to quite the extent that Jared Goff does, as opposed to going outside. The Niners happen to be very strong in the middle with Fred Warner, with Dre Greenlaw.
I was going to say, it feels like we've seen a few times this year, Fred Warner or Dre Greenlaw just, hey, I'm in the middle of the field, interception, cool.
Yeah, and then the comps to who the Lions have played with that sort of characteristic on defense, Chicago leaps to mind. They didn't really play well, right? So there is already some comps on that. The other sort of...
I mean, the Ravens?
Right, exactly. Yeah. The Ravens being another one. That's exactly right. So there's that. Secondly, there's there's no rain, so that's not going to affect Brock Purdy here on the other side. One of the other big things is, okay, well, that's great, but listen, the Niners defense gives up a ton of yards, and obviously with Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, the Lions have the personnel to exploit that. Well, while we were doing the Megapod, because Todd actually brought it up, he's like, okay, yeah, that's all great, but what about this? Cleve actually looked it up while we were doing the Megapod. So which are the teams that have had a greater than 50% success rate in the running game against the Niners? Those teams are Washington, believe it or not, had the highest success rate, near 60% success rate against the Niners defense. The others, Seattle, Tampa Bay, and the Rams. Now, what were the results of those games? They beat Washington by 17. The Niners beat Seattle by 12. They beat Tampa Bay by 13. And they beat the Rams by 7. The game that the Rams won was Week 17, where it didn't matter for the Niners.
Which is almost impressive that it's that high of a winning margin when you're literally talking about the teams that ran the ball best against them.
That's right. The point of that being, so for all those, because we've all talked ad nauseum about these two games, much like we will for 2 weeks about the Super Bowl. So you try to think of all the different angles that we haven't spoken about. One of those that we've heard from multiple guests, not only on this show, but I'm sure throughout the network, throughout all mainstream media, is, that's the real Achilles heel. But the point being that you can withstand 4 to 5 yards per rush in modern day NFL, and it absolutely doesn't kill you. It doesn't. What you're trying to avoid are the big chunk pass plays, and the Niners are actually set up well against the Lions in that respect, as we just talked about. So, again, and I mentioned this in the previous segment, what horrible luck for the Lions in their 2 NFC Championship appearances that we've been alive for, or that some of us have, some of us even remember, some of us who were even there at the other one, because I was, to have played, to end up playing these 2 behemoth teams 30-plus years apart.
Yeah, I keep going back to in this game, much like I did with Green Bay before we were breaking that game down, okay, if you can run the ball and establish, because the pass defense is so good, you don't want to be in obvious pass situations against the Niners, so what's the easiest way to do that? Actually gain some yardage running the ball, and you saw Aaron Jones do that effectively early, And then it was, I think everybody went crazy over what he did to the Niners, but he had the one long run.
He did.
And you take that out of it, and then you really go and break down his stats, and you're like, all right, well, they kind of ran the ball okay on them. Like, they ran it a lot.
By the way, that run, when he had that run, that was the moment of many moments, but that was maybe the biggest moment where you thought, wow, the Niners are going to lose this football game.
Right.
Yeah.
And kind of what I'm saying here is, we talked about this on Monday, but it was me watching that game. It was, okay, between the rain with Purdy, the Deebo getting hurt, then seemingly throwing off one of the greatest offensive play callers in the NFL's entire plan for the game, and him not being able to recover. And then the 49ers still won the game.
And they still won the game.
That's the thing I keep going back to.
Well, so let's go to that Deebo point.
Yeah.
Because I have been among those who say, and maybe I'm louder than most on this, where I'm like, hey, something does happen to the Niners. Like, as elite as this team is, when they lose one of the cogs of their machine on offense, they seem to fall off a cliff. And so let's take Deebo, because Deebo's obviously the one in question here. You know, I came out of that game saying, wow, like when they lose Deebo, they seem to fall off a cliff. Here it is again. What is it about the makeup of this team? And the answer, the knee-jerk reaction to that question is, well, because Deebo does so many different things to that offense.
Yeah.
Well, again, this is on the Beating the Book Megapod. I'm sorry to promote it 100 times here. But we were talking about that, and I brought that up, and Cleve was like, well, I got something to say about that later in the show. And what he did say was, it's actually a little bit masked in the sense that, yes, in this past game, Deebo Williams was out. Their performance dropped off. This is me speaking now. But there was rain involved, and Brock Purdy was having trouble wiping off his hand during the game. But typically when Deebo didn't play this year, you know what else happened? You know who else didn't play? Trent Williams didn't play. So there's a bit of fallacy to that, where it's like, it's actually not Deebo.
Yeah.
It was that Deebo was out at the same time Trent Williams is. And maybe besides Christian McCaffrey, Trent Williams is the single most important player on that offense. To which I quipped, of course, boy, you know who could use Trent Williams? The Washington Commodores. But we know how that went. But I thought that was a great pushback to that notion as well.
Absolutely.
Where it's like, nah, that's actually not what was at play. So, and we just looked at it 3 or 4 different ways there, where it comes up Niners every which way. So I just really believe that this is, and again, sorry, Lions fans, I know you hate me already, but it's like, by the way, I was like, what, do you still have them 9th? Or no, they said 10th. I was like, no, actually I had them as high as 9th this year. And then my
they've gone up to 4th for
my
you.
response was, nah, I'm dead last now.
or that.
Dead last. 4 out of 4. So that's how I see it going.
Yeah.
I have the Niners -7. I wasn't fortunate enough to get the -6.5. But as it was ticking towards 7.5 yesterday while we were on air, I grabbed a remaining 7. And then I do have the alt spread of -16.5. That was the one I chose to play at +227. But I could have gone anywhere with it. I could have gone -9.5 at plus money, short plus money, but that's the one I chose.
I mean, look, I think we hit on it a bit yesterday with Crack, but yeah, I think if you see that big of a difference between teams, mix in some alts for sure. So I laid 6.5 one of the days we were on air, and we saw it. I think Circa had it up here. So I did hit the 6.5 of the Niners. I mean, I'm in the same camp as you. I keep going back to that game last week of how much went wrong, and they still won the game. And I don't really know that there's that, after what we saw the end of the season with the Packers, I don't really know that there's that big of a difference between the Packers and the Detroit Lions. And I'm probably crediting more the Packers than taking anything away from the Lions. But still, I think they have the ability to do that. We'll get to the Chiefs-Ravens game later. But yeah, I laid 6.5 here. I do have a teaser from last week with the Niners involved to close out. And then I'm thinking about one more bet that's going to involve both teams that I'll talk about in the last segment. We'll get back to it.
Go to VSiN.com/subscribe to become a VSiN Pro subscriber today.